Joining today's webinar, Illinois' Road to Recovery. The Quad Cities Chamber strives to be your one-stop business resource to assist you during the coronavirus pandemic, connecting you with reliable and accurate information. There's a lot of new information to process and respond to during these rapidly evolving and uncertain times. We always want you to know that Quad City is here for you during COVID and in normal times as well, and as we approach the new normal. We're always advocating for your business at the state and federal levels and providing resources to help you protect the health of your workforce and your operations. We're committed to bringing you the latest information as quickly as possible, and our COVID-19 resource page on our website, quadcitieschamber.com, is updated several times a day. And if you haven't signed up for our e-news, you can do that on our website as well. Joining us today is Michael Negron, Assistant Director for the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. We're excited to have Michael join us today. We shared with you yesterday the Illinois guidelines for reopening in phase 3, and Michael will share with us some more information about that in the coming minutes. But a little bit about Michael. He was born and raised in Illinois and devoted his career to public service. He's a veteran, and we thank him for that. He served in the U.S. Navy after college and worked in both the White House and on Capitol Hill at the depths of the financial crisis. He returned back to Chicago, worked for Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and is now with Governor Pritzker's administration. He was a 2017 Edgar Fellow and recognized as Crain's Chicago Business's 40 Under 40 class of 2015. So it's exciting to have Michael on the team and with us here today. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and posted on our chamber website. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and I'll do my best to incorporate them into the Q&A portion. With that, Michael, thanks for joining us. If you'd like to start us off and talk to us about the latest information about easing restrictions on Illinois' businesses.
Sure. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the, I'm going to share my screen. Thanks to the Quad Cities Chamber for your great partnership. I know we did a meeting last week to give a preview of the guidelines, and so we appreciate being able to call upon you to help communicate with businesses and get your feedback on how the state can be doing a better job. So I'm very happy with our partnership, and I want to continue it particularly during these hard times when I know that there's lots up in the air right now, and there's a lot of anxiety, and so that makes the chamber more important, and it makes our partnership more important. So I will jump in. So I have these large headphones. I have kids in the background. I think they might be in downstairs now, but you might hear stuff in the background. So apologies in advance. So I will keep the presented part brief so that we can spend some time on questions. So overall, as I hope has been clear from his daily press conferences and just the overall tone that the governor has taken, public health has been the leading driver of our state strategy. And I think too often in the national debate and in the local debate, sometimes things get framed as public health versus economic. And you're either totally shut down or you're totally open, and there's nothing in between. But I think most people know that's not quite right, and that they go together. That people will start coming back to restaurants, will start going back out to movie theaters, going back to amusement parks, going back to the store, if they understand the strategy, if they believe that the health system can protect them, and that different preventative measures are in place to keep them safe. And so the governor has really tried to hew to that. Where we are looking at the latest health metrics to understand where the spread is taking place, to make sure that we have capacity in our health system, so that in the event that there is a surge, and the history of pandemics show that you typically don't have just one wave, and so you can have multiple waves. I wonder if this is going to be a common thread here, but once the pandemic started, I've started reading more history on the 1918 flu, and looking at other pandemics, and the second wave was much worse than the first wave, and then there was a third wave, and so the governor keeps all this in mind as he thinks about how to strike the right balance, how to make sure that we are having measures in place, allowing, as the data supports it, more activity to take place over time, while making important investments in our health system to make sure that we have adequate testing, that we have a contact tracing system, so that in the event, as we loosen restrictions and more activities taking place, we have the ability to quickly, if someone tests positive, quickly identify who they've been in contact with. Do we have adequate infrastructure in place so that folks who can't quarantine themselves from their families or other folks can stay somewhere, can stay in a hotel room, can stay in some other space and get the support they need to access food and access any medical care they need while they're quarantining. So we viewed these as tied together, and so the strategy that the governor's been implementing has been we view it as a connection between those two, restoring economic activity while continuing to make investments in public health, so that we can handle not only the cases that we do have, but any future cases, particularly if there is what has been talked about in the media in the fall. You could have added pressure from both the flu and a COVID and COVID cases. So the Restore Illinois plan is a 5-phase regional approach. We are currently in phase 2, which I'm sure everybody's very familiar with. Every region is on track right now to move to phase 3 by Friday. And with phase 3 comes new activities that can be allowed, personal care services, everything from barbershops to salons to parlors to nails will be allowed again, and folks can go to those places, but there's new provisions in place. Outdoor dining is another one that's gotten a lot of attention. Manufacturing beyond what was referred to as essential when we first started this process. All retail, subject to some capacity limits. So, and the metrics that allowed us to get here are the ones that you hear him, if you listen to his daily press conference, this is what he talks about. So what percentage of our cases are positive? When we started doing this, it was north of 20%. And those numbers continue to go down to the low teens right now. In some regions, it's in the single digits. In the Northeast region, it's now below 15%. So we want to see a lower what they call positivity rate. We want to see that continue to decline. We want to see new hospitalizations for COVID go down. We look at the capacity. What's our ICU bed capacity? What's our ventilator capacity? And then how are we doing in setting up a tracing system, contact tracing system? And so you move from one phase to another and potentially back if those metrics continue to be met, or if there is an upsurge in cases. And so that's what we're looking at. But we're happy to see that we're moving into phase 3, and then phase 4. The plan envisions a 28-day look back, and so if things remain on track, moving to phase 4 potentially by the end of June. So that is, in short, just the plan that we've been seeking to implement. And I want to make a point that this is an unprecedented situation. So we put out this plan, and with a lot of support from public health, a lot of their analysis, but things can ultimately change. And so we want to keep talking. We want to keep hearing from you. We keep talking as an administration, but I just want to emphasize this is something that we haven't seen before. And so everybody's trying to make the best of the choices that we have. And oftentimes it's the governor or other folks in the administration, we're choosing between bad options because we're trying to protect people, but we know that some of the measures to protect people has a bad economic impact on business owners. And so we're always trying to strive the right balance, but the governor recognizes that these aren't great choices that we have in front of us in the middle of this pandemic. So the phase 3 guidelines were announced on Sunday. There are 10 different types of workplaces that we issued guidelines for, from manufacturing offices to service counters, which would be like a dry cleaner or places where you don't necessarily have the whole retail store behind it. It's just a service counter, shoe repair, the service counter or an auto shop. So a whole range of service. I've talked about personal care, health and fitness is another area, day camps, outdoor recreation. And so for each of these, there's a set of guidelines. There's themes that everybody will recognize. We want to see social distance, 6 feet, wherever possible, personal protective equipment, masks, in some cases, as soon as you enter a facility. In other cases, if it's clear that you can't maintain 6 feet. And so those will vary with the different workplace types. There's some group activities, for example, in youth sports and in day camps. We want to see groups, our public health folks want to see groups of 10. And, you know, let's say you have an outdoor day camp, group of 10, then 30 feet, then a group of 10, then 30 feet. So it's spelled out in the guidelines. And, you know, my experience with the first few phases of this is that you can't write a rule for everything. And so we put out these guidelines. We did some outreach before, including with the Quad City Chamber. But, you know, we're going to learn more. And so as more businesses try to adhere to these, we'll hear about new issues, things we didn't anticipate, you know, the impacts of different rules that might really hit certain types of businesses or certain subsets within those industries. And so that's why it's important for you to communicate to the chamber, with the chamber, for the chamber to communicate with us, because we know that things can change even within a phase, just because, again, this is very unprecedented. And so we are learning as we go along. And the example I'll give you is, you know, when we originally laid out phase 3, the anticipation was that that restaurants would not happen until phase 4. And over the last couple of weeks, there's been more studies out about how much safer outdoors are than indoors. And so we worked to develop some guidelines to allow for outdoor dining. And, you know, I can't commit that other things will change or not, but the science is moving quickly. People are learning a lot more about COVID-19, how it spreads, how it doesn't spread, its impact on the body. And so I would say that that's why the communications is important, because just because something is in a plan doesn't mean that we adhere to it 100%, because it's a new situation. And so we want to make sure that we're flexible and ready to make changes as needed. So in terms of our response and how we've tried to blunt the economic impact, it's been a all hands on deck approach. We, at the early stages of this, we looked at existing money that we had and just tried to find new ways of using it. So for example, the $14 million hospitality grant program was 3 different sources of money for different purposes. There was a workforce training money, technology money, and then we had sort of general all-purpose money, and we repurposed it to support this program. The downstate stabilization, we had some flexibility for community development block grants, so that it could go, traditionally it goes to sort of bigger infrastructure projects, but we were able to carve out a variant where local governments can apply on behalf of small businesses and get these, you know, $25,000 or less grants to get to businesses that need the working capital to continue operating. The Small Business Loan Fund, we had some existing dollars that support another loan program that we have, and we repurposed it to do an emergency loan fund. We've been working with our partners on workforce issues, and so the Get Hired Illinois is meant to be an easier way to connect folks who've lost their jobs with jobs that are opening up. So the early stages of this, we're trying to find any dollars that weren't being used and to repurpose them to get funds to the businesses that need it. The federal government has then put a lot of funds into programs like the PPP. There is the Coronavirus Recovery Fund, which allows governments to be reimbursed for costs, and one of those costs are business grants. So as the rest of the country starts to develop initiatives that to support businesses, we then in turn will do the same. And so the bullet at the bottom there, you may have seen it didn't get a ton of coverage, but part of the bills that were passed this weekend included an appropriation on the order of several $100 million that we are going to develop some grant programs to get similar, similar to the hospitality grant program, but with a broader focus we now have the authority and then the ability to get reimbursed by the federal government to do similar targeted grant programs that we can move quickly. And so that's something the bill just passed. The governor has to sign it, but we don't anticipate that being an issue. And so we are actively now developing plans to get those business grants out the door. And a substantial portion, at least half of those grant funds, have to be to support businesses that are delivering childcare, daycare, things like that. So we have a lot of work to do in the coming weeks to stand up those programs. But this next phase, as we reopen, we also should have more funds, thanks to the federal CARES Act, to actually get assistance to those businesses, in particular those that are being left behind, who aren't opening yet, or those that have been disproportionately hit by the nature of this crisis. So hospitality is one that's been hit very hard. Health and fitness has been hit very hard. There's been a big impact on minority-owned businesses and on minority communities. So those are all the principles that are going into as we think about how to invest these coronavirus recovery fund dollars. And so I'll just highlight a couple things that are out there now, then we can go to questions. So we have a number of, and this is an example of something that was repurposed. So Rebuild Illinois, which the governor passed with the General Assembly last year, our capital plan, created a couple different pots. We've carved out, we had a $50 million NOFO out for public infrastructure, so local governments could apply for infrastructure work. We've carved out a portion of it, 25 million, that can be accessed more quickly. And so the application's out. There's been great interest. We encourage you to take a look. If the applicants here are local governments, but if they're projects you know of, to communicate with your local governments. But this is a program where we can then support projects between 500,000 and 5 million. It could be things like school extensions, road work, water main replacement, sewer main replacement, with the idea that we would get funding out more quickly, which hopefully then creates construction jobs. And also with less folks on the roads, it's a good time to do construction work. So that's a big program. I mentioned the Downstate Stabilization Program. This is a community development block grant. The applicants have to be local governments. There are these HUD rules that aren't the most nimble. So this application is nowhere near as simple or as easy as I would want it to be because of the federal rules here. But we are working with communities to try to get applications in so we can get these grants to businesses. And it's very flexible money, so it can be used for working capital. And it doesn't have, for example, in the PPP, you have to use, if you want to get the loan converted to the grant, you have to have a certain portion be payroll. Here, it's working capital. So you can use it to make rent payments, you can use it to do payroll, you can use it to do other things. So there's more flexibility here. And then we have alluded to this, but the Rebuild Illinois funds, we have a number of NOFOs out there now. I mentioned public infrastructure. We have 2 regional economic development and shovel-ready sites where the applicants can be developers, can be businesses. These are different, this is still capital, right? So it's still, you gotta build stuff, you gotta dig into the ground, you gotta acquire property. There's criteria in these capital funds, but they're still out there, and they're both for regional economic development and shovel-ready sites. They're both rolling, so there's no firm deadline. I mean, we'll give it out until the money's gone. So that's something it's worth looking into if your communities haven't already. But those are existing resources that are still out there. I'll close by just listing out here just the different ways in which you can reach us. We've mentioned here our Team Red member. So he is Adrian is your point of contact. Jonathan is Jonathan, who's our head of our Team Red, is on the call as well. But we encourage you to reach out if you have questions, want to learn more about these programs. We want to be in touch with you. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Michael, thanks for the overview of what the state of Illinois is doing in response to COVID-19. Wanted to hit on some of the business toolkit information that you've posted. We shared this on our website yesterday with our members. A lot of information out there. Can you share with us a little bit about what is mandated for businesses to implement, so that way they can safely and responsibly reopen when the governor gives the word later this week?
Sure. So the guidelines cover a whole host of, maybe I'll just share my screen again, just so you can see it, or at least you can anchor. So the guidelines provide a framework for reopening. Ultimately, local businesses and local public health departments, local governments will want to work with businesses on what's doable within the guidelines. We know that not everything is always going to be perfectly met. For example, in the manufacturing guidelines, the goal is, can you either have barriers between workstations or have the workstations 6 feet apart? That's not always going to be possible. All right, so we understand that, that's the ideal. That's not always going to be possible, but we want to lay out that principle, and then as needed, work with you. Well, if I can't do these things, can I make up for it somewhere else? Right? Can I make sure that there's PPE available? Can I stagger shifts? Can I make sure that I'm limiting contact in the break rooms? So we understand that every business is different, but the principles are maintaining social distance, having access both for the consumer. There are cases where the consumer needs to be wearing a face covering of some kind to go, for example, to go in a retail store, right? That's an obligation that's on the consumer. Some places may decide to hand it out if they want to, but that's not an obligation that's being put on people. Maintaining social distance, not only as just putting in the guidelines that people should be 6 feet apart, but the capacity restrictions are meant to help get at that, right? So for retail, and it's similar in the guidelines now for the DCEO is issued for essential retail, but now it applies more broadly, 50% of occupancy or 5 per 1,000 square feet. And it's we leave that to the business to figure out what's easier to calculate and easier to figure out. But that helps support the need to do social distancing. In the case of in the case of personal care, getting your hair cut, getting your nails done, what have you, both it's services where the consumer and the technician are both wearing masks, for example. Right? And so in the case of outdoor dining, tables need to be 6 feet apart. Table parties should be 6 or less, but there's no occupancy limit. It's really because we know that local governments, we're hearing about it every day. There are places that are going to close off streets or allow for more flexibility in using the public way, so that restaurants can do outdoor dining. And there are many cases where maybe a restaurant isn't permitted to do it now, but we're encouraging local governments to figure it out with those businesses, right? And so if I've got a parking lot and I want to do outdoor dining and the local government's supportive, then you can rig up some tables outside, and as long as they're 6 feet apart and the workers are wearing masks and hands are being washed and all these other things that I know local health departments are very concerned about, then we're good to go, right? So we're laying out principles. We know that people are going to be innovative in trying to meet them, but again, we understand that not everything can be met 100%, but we want to at least lay out what those principles are. And in many cases, we think business may not be able to meet that one in particular, but can make up for it in other ways. And a lot of this is about communicating to the public, right? So I think this is as much guidelines for business, but we also wanted the public to be able to see this is what they're being asked to do, right? And ideally that encourages folks to get out and know that, well, if I go to this restaurant, I go to the retail, okay, I see people wearing masks. I see that they're, early in the crisis, we had our sump pump fail. I had to go to Home Depot. I was made to line up. I had a lineup outside. They were counting who was going in. I went in, I saw they were cleaning the shopping carts, and it made me feel safer, right? So I think we're trying to take those practices and communicate them because that's a big part about just confidence.
Good. Thanks, Michael, for going into a little bit more detail on that one. I have a few questions from participants. The first one is about hotels. or do you have any specific guidelines as part of the phase 3 reopening about hotels, or specifically about pool and fitness centers?
As I understand it, so one, hotels have been operating, and I believe that the general prohibition on fitness centers did not apply in phase 1 and phase 2, did not apply to fitness centers within hotels. As far as pools, I believe they cannot operate now, but it's something that we're talking about with public health because they ultimately regulate pools. So for that, I will, number one, and maybe Jonathan can make a note of it, let me make sure that what I said here was 100% accurate with respect to the hotels. But on pools and hotels, I think there's some ongoing conversations about that could be relevant to the next few weeks, because ultimately it is an Illinois Public Health Department. It's within their purview, and then on hotels more broadly, as I mentioned, hotels have been operating. A big question that we're going to be working on for phase 4 is events at hotels, because we know that's a major revenue source, and so that's something that we are talking about actively now, not only with McCormick Place, which is a huge event location, but with the Illinois Hotel and Lodging Association, knowing that events down at the hotel, there are tons of hotel events, weddings, business meetings, huge source of revenue, and so we want to figure out how those can be done safely as we approach phase 4.
Good. I have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. One is related to seasonal businesses. When you're talking about your grant programs, there are companies or even sports franchises that have been impacted. Do you see any grants or programs that might target those types of businesses?
I'd be happy to learn more. I mean, we really are, the money just got, for the grants that we're working on, the bill just passed. The governor's got to sign it. And so, we want to make sure that we are taking account of all of the different impacts from the pandemic. And so I think, from where I stand now, that's something that I'd be very interested in hearing. Maybe Jonathan can follow up, just learning a little bit more about the issue from the questioner, and then going from there. But I will say that the other programs have at least taken into account seasonality. The Paycheck Protection Program had seasonality considerations built into it. So I don't think it's a crazy thing or an unusual thing. I just want to learn more.
Good. We'll follow up with Jonathan on that one. And the last question, if the data comes back and a second wave hits, what's the process? What does that look like? Would we jump back to stage 1, or can you talk through the stages as you monitor those numbers?
Yeah, so, I think, in principle, we want to be prepared to move back a phase if there is an outbreak. However, as I said at the beginning, we're doing this for the first time. This is unprecedented crisis. We are working diligently to build contact tracing capacity. We are working diligently to build testing capacity. I think where we were a month ago and where we are now, I think we're like the number 2 per capita testing state in the country, regularly doing 20,000 or more, and we want to get that up even higher. So, I don't want to speak for the administration on such a hypothetical. The plan envisions moving back a phase, but I do want to say these investments in these other components of it, testing and contact tracing, are meant to make it so that we don't need to be so heavy-handed. So I would say that the plan has got that, and it's built into the design of the plan, but the plan also includes investing in these other measures to make it so that we can be more targeted.
Okay. Great. Well, Michael, thank you. We've come to the end of our program. A half hour goes by really fast. I want to thank everybody for joining today. Thank you very much for sharing the information that you and your colleagues have been working on with Governor Pritzker's leadership. Again, this webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website, quadcitieschamber.com. Stay up to date with us on social media. Download the business toolkits for business reopening in Illinois phase 3. Michael, if there's any follow-up information that the state would like to get out to Quad Cities businesses, please share it with us and we'll get it out to our members. We'll continue to talk with you about what we're hearing from our area community and what we can do to work together to ease those restrictions and make sure that we're taking consideration of both health and well-being as you move forward into your phases. But thank you for what you're doing. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Have a good one.
You too.